Hall of Terrence Prime had never seen so many species gathered in one place. 12 delegates sat in their designated section, each one representing billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. The ceiling stretched so high that clouds actually formed near the top, and the walls were made of a crystal that changed color based on the emotional state of whoever was speaking. Right now, the crystal burned an angry orange as the ambassador finished his demand. Grant stood near the back of the human section, watching everything with quiet eyes. He was not the senior diplomat here. That honor belonged to Ambassador Lisa Monroe, a woman who had spent 30 years building relationships across the galaxy. Daniel was just her, a man who carried documents and whispered advice when needed. But Lisa had learned long ago that Daniel saw things others missed. She valued his silence almost as much as his words. Astor was a tall creature with scales that shifted between purple and black. His name was Hose, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who had never lost a negotiation. His species had been expanding for decades now, swallowing colony after colony along the frontier. 3 of those colonies had been human. 12,000 people who had built homes and farms and schools, now living under occupation. Spread his forearms wide as he addressed the assembly. He explained that they were simply reclaiming territory that had always been theirs. The frontier was too wild, too dangerous for younger species to manage. They were doing everyone a favor of bringing order to chaos. His voice dripped with false kindness, and Daniel felt his stomach turn. Speaker of the rose to respond. There were beings who had dominated galactic politics for 6 centuries. They were not warriors themselves, but they controlled the trade routes in the banks. When the species listened. Compound eyes reflected the light of a dozen suns as he clicked his mandibles together. Speaker expressed concern about the expansion, but cautioned against hasty reaction. War was expensive. War disrupted trade. War killed consumers and workers who might otherwise contribute to galactic prosperity. Surely there was a diplomatic solution that could satisfy everyone. Perhaps the affected species could be compensated for their losses. Perhaps new territories could be opened elsewhere. I watched Lisa's hands tighten on the armrests of her chair. He knew what she was thinking. They were already planning to sacrifice the human colonies. To them, 12,000 humans were a rounding error. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 500 years. They were still considered children by species who measured their histories in tens of thousands of years. Rose to speak, and the crystal shifted to a neutral blue. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, and she carried herself with a dignity that made larger beings pay attention. She reminded the assembly that the human colonies had been established legally under galactic charter. She pointed out that they had no historical claim to those systems. She argued that allowing the expansion to continue would only encourage more aggression. And as she spoke, Daniel could see the other delegation losing interest. They were whispering among themselves. The admiral was checking his communicator. The representative had actually closed 2 of his 3 eyes. They had already decided that humanity was not worth fighting for. Debate continued for hours. Species rose and fell, making arguments and counter-arguments that went nowhere. They sat in smug silence, knowing that time was on their side. Every day that passed meant their hold on the occupied territories grew stronger. Every day meant more of their soldiers and administrators arriving to cement control. The High Speaker proposed a compromise that would halt their expansion at its current boundaries. In exchange, the occupied territories would be recognized as legitimate claims. The affected species would receive trade concessions and access to new markets. It was a clean solution, a business transaction that turned conquered people into acceptable losses. I felt something cold settle in his chest. He had seen that before in human history. He had studied the conferences where powerful nations carved up weaker ones. He had read about the agreements that trade freedom for convenience. The galaxy was old, but its sins were not new. Stood again, her voice steady but her eyes burning. She rejected the proposal on behalf of Earth and all human colonies. She stated that humanity would not abandon its people. She demanded that they withdraw from all occupied territories immediately. All fell silent for a moment, and then several delegates actually laughed. Not cruel laughter, but the pain and amusement of adults watching a child throw a tantrum. The representative opened all 3 eyes just to roll them. Even the usually neutral seemed embarrassed on humanity's behalf. Rose again, his scales now shifting to a mocking shade of bright yellow. He thanked the human ambassador for her passion, but to get she considered reality. The fleet numbered over 10,000 vessels. Human forces were barely a tenth of that size. If humanity chose to fight, they would be crushed within weeks. Their colonies would burn, they would fall, and their species would become a footnote in galactic history. He was offering them mercy, and they were too foolish to accept. She opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel touched her arm. She looked at him, surprised. In all the years working together, he had never interrupted her during a session, but something in his eyes made her pause. She gave him a small nod and sat back down. Remained standing in his place near the back. He did not move toward the speaking platform. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched as the assembly began to move toward a vote that would seal the fate of 12,000 humans. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Grant began to plan not as a diplomat, but as something far older and far more dangerous. Crystals on the walls flickered, unable to read the emotion of a man who had learned to feel nothing at all. Slat had 3 hours, and Daniel spent most of it sitting alone in a small observation room overlooking the station's central garden. The garden was filled with plants from 100 different worlds, each one carefully maintained in its own climate-controlled section. It was meant to symbolize the diversity and cooperation of galactic civilization. Daniel thought it looked more like a collection of prisoners in separate cells. So found him there just before the session was scheduled to resume. She sat down beside him without speaking, waiting for him to explain what he was planning. They had known each other for 15 years, and she had learned that Daniel only acted when he had something important to say. I told her he wanted to request a private meeting with the senior diplomats. Not a formal session, just a conversation. Lisa asked him why, and he said he wanted to give them a history lesson. She studied his face for a long moment, trying to read what lay beneath his calm expression. Then she nodded and said she would arrange it. It took place in a chamber reserved for quiet negotiation. High Speaker was there, his compound eyes gleaming with curiosity. Counselor of the Cooperative sat in a hoverchair, her ancient body frail but her mind still sharp. Fleet Admiral York of the Hegemony stood near the door with his arms crossed, looking like he would rather be anywhere else. A few other senior representatives filled the remaining seats. I thanked them for coming. He said he understood that humanity was a young species in their eyes. He acknowledged that 500 years of space travel was nothing compared to the thousands of years that older species had accumulated. He admitted that humans had smaller fleets, fewer colonies, and less political influence than almost anyone in the assembly. His mandibles impatiently and asked what the point of the meeting was. Daniel smiled slightly and asked them a question. He asked what they knew about human history before space travel. Responses were predictable. Counselor said she knew humans had gone through various stages of social development, much like in species. Admiral York grunted that he had heard humans used to fight among themselves before they learned better, added that primitive conflict was common among young species, and that humanity had clearly matured past such behavior. Not as if agreeing with them. Then he began to talk about the 20th century on Earth. He described a conflict called the First World War, where humans had killed each other by the millions over a few patches of land. He explained how they had invented new weapons just to make the killing more efficient: poison gas that melt lungs, machines that could fire hundreds of bullets per minute, explosives that could level entire cities. Aliens listened with growing discomfort. Counselor pulled up records on her datapad, cross-referencing what Daniel was saying with historical archives. Her expression shifted from skepticism to concern as she realized he was not exaggerating. Continued. He told them about the Second World War, which happened just 20 years after the first. He described how humans had built factories specifically designed to murder millions of their own kind. He explained the concept of strategic bombing, where entire cities full of civilians were set on fire just to break the enemy's will. He told them about two weapons called atomic bombs, devices that could destroy a city in a single flash of light. Admiral York interrupted to say that nuclear weapons were not unique to humans. Many species had developed them. Daniel agreed, but asked how many species had actually used them against their own kind. The room fell silent. His voice trembled slightly as she read from her datapad. She had found the casualty figures for Earth's 20th century: 70 million dead in the Second World War alone, another 20 million in the First World War, countless millions more in small conflicts, revolutions, and genocides. The numbers kept scrolling across her screen, each one representing a life extinguished by human hand. Compound eyes had stopped gleaming. He asked Daniel why he was telling them this. Every species had a violent past. They had fought wars before they became traitors. They had nearly destroyed themselves in civil conflict. What made human violence special? He leaned forward slowly. He said the difference was that humans had never stopped being capable of such violence. Other species had evolved past their aggressive instincts. They had genetically modified themselves, or developed social structures that prevented conflict, or simply grown too old and tired to fight. Humans had done none of these things. Explained that humans still felt rage and hatred and the desire for revenge. They still dreamed of glory and conquest and domination. Every generation raised children who could become killers if pushed hard enough. The only thing that kept humanity peaceful was choice. They chose to build instead of destroy. They chose to trade instead of conquer. They chose to cooperate instead of dominate. A choice could change. He stood up slowly. He looked at each of the alien leaders in turn, making sure they understood what he was saying. He told them that humanity had not evolved into peaceful beings. They had simply decided that peace was more profitable than war, and if someone forced them to reconsider that decision, they still remembered how to do the other thing. Well, York uncrossed his arms. His species were warriors themselves, bred for combat over thousands of years, but even he looked unsettled by what Daniel was describing. He asked if Daniel was threatening them. He shook his head. He said he was not threatening anyone. He was simply providing information that might be useful in the upcoming vote. He wanted them to understand exactly what they were dealing with before they decided to abandon human colonies to them. Walked toward the door, then paused. He told them there was an old human saying: "Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it." He suggested they spend the remaining recess time researching human history more thoroughly. The archives were quite comprehensive. He left them alone with their datapads and their growing fear. An assembly reconvened under a ceiling that had turned dark gray, reflecting the mood of the gathered species. Daniel noticed that several delegations were looking at the human section differently now. They kept glancing at their datapads, then back at Lisa Monroe, then back at their datapads again. Admiral York had moved his chair slightly farther from the human section, as if proximity might be dangerous. The speaker called the session to order, but his usual confidence seemed diminished. His mandibles clicked in an uneven rhythm that Daniel had learned to recognize as anxiety. They had clearly spent the recess doing their own research. Had noticed none of this. Ambassador Ho strode to the central platform with his scales gleaming in triumphant gold. He announced that the time for debate was over. His government had authorized him to make a final offer that would accept the current boundaries and promise to expand no further for the next 50 years. In exchange, all occupied territories would become permanent holdings. Any species that did not accept this offer would be considered hostile to us. And watched the other delegations shift uncomfortably in their seats. 50 years was nothing to species that lived for centuries, but it was enough time for them to pretend the problem had been solved. They could vote for peace today and let future generations deal with the consequences. Stood to respond, but before she could speak, Commander Porter leaned forward and whispered urgently in her ear. Was the military advisor assigned to the human delegation, a man who had spent his career preparing for wars he hoped would never come. His face was red with barely controlled anger, and his hands were shaking. So listened to whatever was saying, then shook her head firmly. She rose and addressed the assembly in a measured tone. She stated that humanity could not accept any agreement that abandoned its citizens to occupation. She proposed instead that they withdraw completely and submit the territorial dispute to Galactic Arbitration. Laughed openly. The sound was harsh and grating, like metal scraping against stone. He asked the assembly to consider the absurdity of this demand. Humanity had no leverage. Their fleet was small. Their colonies were scattered and poorly defended. There was located in a region of space that they could reach within weeks if they chose to. What exactly did humanity think they could threaten? Directly toward Lisa and spoke with deliberate cruelty. He said that humans were a young species that bred slowly and died easily. In the time it took humans to replace one generation, they could produce 10. Any war between them would end with human extinction, not because they were cruel, but simply because mathematics did not favor the weak. Stood up before Lisa could stop him. His voice cracked with emotion as he declared that humanity would fight to the last person before accepting rule. He said that every human ship would become a weapon, every colony a fortress, every citizen a soldier. They might win eventually, but the cost would be more than they could bear. Simply murmured at this outburst. Such emotional displays were considered primitive, evidence that humanity had not yet learned proper diplomatic behavior. Counselor looked at with something that might have been pity. Admiral York's expression suggested he had heard similar boasts from species that no longer existed. Waited for the murmuring to die down, then dismissed words with a wave of his upper arms. He said that every conquered species meets such threats. None of them ever followed through. When the time came, they submitted or they died, and either way, the result was the same. Dominance was inevitable. The only question was how much suffering would precede it. So pulled back into his seat and whispered something that made him go silent. Then she looked toward Daniel, who had remained motionless throughout the exchange. There was a question in her eyes, and Daniel answered it with a slight nod. So addressed the assembly one more time. She said that her wish to speak directly to the gathered representatives. She asked for permission to grant him the floor. The high speaker had clearly been affected by his earlier conversation with Daniel, and he seemed unsure whether giving the human more time to speak was wise. But refusing would look like fear, and they could not afford to appear weak in front of so many species. He granted permission with a curt nod. He rose from his seat and walked slowly toward the central platform. Every eye in the chamber followed him. He was not an impressive figure by galactic standards. He was shorter than most of the aliens present, with no natural weapons or armor or obvious strength. His hair was gray at the temples, and his face showed the lines of a life spent thinking rather than fighting. Something about the way he moved made the assembly pay attention. It was not aggression. It was not fear. It was the calm, measured walk of someone who had already decided what needed to be done and was simply moving toward the inevitable conclusion. He reached the platform and stood in the exact center, where the acoustic systems would carry his voice to every corner of the vast hall. The ceiling crystals flickered uncertainly, unable to categorize the emotion they were dictating. And looked out at the wolf species who would decide the fate of 12,000 humans. He took a slow breath, and he began to speak. He did not speak immediately. He stood on the platform and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The assembly shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A data pad clattered against the desk. Still Daniel waited. He finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle. He said he wanted to tell them a story about a small island nation on Earth called Japan. He explained that for centuries, Japan had been isolated from the rest of the world. They were proud people with ancient traditions and a warrior culture that valued honor above life itself. Described how in the 20th century, Japan had gone to war against a much larger nation called the United States. He told them about a surprise attack on a place called Pearl Harbor, where Japanese forces destroyed much of the American fleet in a single morning. The attack was brilliant. The attack was successful. The attack was the worst mistake Japan ever made. Somebody listened with growing curiosity. They were not sure where the story was going, but something in Daniel's tone kept them focused. Continued. He said that after Pearl Harbor, the Americans did not negotiate. They did not seek a diplomatic solution. They did not offer concessions in exchange for peace. Instead, they rebuilt their fleet. They mobilized their entire economy for war. They transformed from a nation of farmers and factory workers into a military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Described the island hunting campaign that followed, where American forces fought their way across the Pacific Ocean one bloody island at a time. He talked about a place called Okinawa, where tens of thousands of soldiers died fighting over volcanic rocks and coral beaches. He explained that the Japanese fought with incredible bravery, often preferring death to surrender, and the Americans matched them kill for kill. Told them about August 1945. He described two cities called Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He explained that the Americans had built weapons capable of destroying an entire city with a single bomb. They did not use these weapons against military targets. They used them against civilian population, killing over 200,000 people in 2 flashes of light. Flora had been following along on her datapad. Her hands were trembling as she pulled up images from the archives. The pictures showed ruins that stretched to the horizon, shadows burned in stone where people had been standing when the bombs exploded, survivors with skin melting off their bodies. He paused to let the image sink in. Then he said something that made the entire assembly go still. He said the Americans had not used those weapons because they were evil. They had used them because they calculated that invasion would cost millions of lives on both sides. They chose to burn 2 cities in order to end a war that might otherwise have consumed their entire generation. It was the most terrible math in human history, and they did it without hesitation. Master Hose interrupted to ask what any of this had to do with the current situation. His voice had lost some of its confidence, but he was trying to maintain his composure. And he'll turn to face the directly. He said he was getting to that part. Explained that humans had a concept called total war. Most species fought limited conflicts with clear objectives and acceptable casualties. They fought until one side gained an advantage, then they negotiated. They preserved infrastructure and populations because those things had value. Humans did not always fight that way. Pushed beyond certain limits, humans fought to destroy. Not to defeat, not to conquer, but to annihilate. They burned crops and poisoned wells so their enemies would starve. They bombed cities and factories so their enemies could not rebuild. They killed until there was nothing left to kill, and then they sawed the earth so nothing would grow there again. His voice remained calm and quiet as he spoke these words. He might have been describing the weather or reading a shopping list. The lack of emotion made everything he said more terrible. Looked around the assembly one more time. He acknowledged that humanity was a young species. He admitted that their fleet was small and their colonies were few. He agreed that in a conventional war, they would almost certainly win. He wanted them to understand something important about humans. When they had nothing left to lose, they did not surrender. They did not submit. They made sure that winning cost more than losing. They turned defeat into mutual annihilation. Paused, the assembly held its breath. Daniel uttered one sentence that changed everything. He said, "We remember how to glass plants." Words hung in the air like a death sentence. Counselor gasped. Admiral York's scales shifted to a pale color that indicated extreme stress. Even High Speaker's compound eyes seemed to dim. Elder Host tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. He asked if the human was threatening to destroy worlds over 12,000 colonists. He shook his head slowly. He said he was not threatening anything. He was simply stating a historical fact. Humans had already proven they would destroy their own cities, their own people, their own future rather than live under domination. They had done it within living memory of some humans still alive today. Asked the assembly to consider what human might do to someone else's city, someone else's people, someone else's future. He stepped down from the platform and walked back to his seat. He sat down beside Lisa Monroe, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. Crystals on the walls had turned a color that no one in the assembly had ever seen before. Later analysis would determine it was the color of existential dread. Assembly dissolved into chaos within seconds of Daniel returning to his seat. High Speaker called for an emergency recess, but no one was listening. Delegations were already huddling together, speaking in urgent whispers, pulling up data on their pads, and sharing it with horrified expression. Our host stood alone on his platform, his scales cycling through colors that indicated confusion and the first stirrings of genuine fear. He kept looking at the human delegation as if seeing them for the first time. These small, fragile creatures who lived such short lives and bred so slowly. He had dismissed them as irrelevant. Now he was not so sure. So Monroe leaned close to Daniel and asked him quietly if he had meant what he said. Daniel did not answer directly. He simply watched the assembly fall apart around them with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the entire ordeal. York pushed through the crowd and approached the human section. His scales had returned to their normal color, but his body language radiated tension. He told Daniel that intelligence had been monitoring human ship designs for decades. They had always assumed humans were simply inefficient engineers, building vessels that sacrificed cargo space for oversized engines and weapon systems. He understood. Human ships were not designed for defense. They were not designed for trade. They were designed to reach any system as quickly as possible and deliver maximum destruction before being destroyed themselves. Every human vessel was a potential suicide bomber carrying enough firepower to sterilize a planet. He nodded slowly but said nothing. Lisa answered for him. She said that humanity always hoped their ships would never be used for their intended purpose, but hope was not a strategy and preparation was not aggression. He stared at her for a long moment, then returned to his delegation. Within minutes, they announced they would support the human position. They had no desire to discover what humanity looked like when it stopped hopping. So approach next. The elderly moved slowly, her hoverchair hung quietly as she navigated through the crowd. She told Daniel that her people had the longest memories in the galaxy. They had watched civilizations rise and fall for hundreds of thousands of years. She had thought she understood the pattern. Species were aggressive because they did not know any better. They fought their wars and learned their lessons and eventually matured into peaceful members of galactic society. It was the natural progression. It was how things always worked. Humans were different. Humans had learned their lessons and remembered their history and still retained the capacity for total destruction. They were not primitive. They were something far more dangerous. They were civilized beings who had chosen to keep their claws sharp. Now that the cooperative would also support the human position. Some lessons, she said, were better learned from observation than experience. By one, other delegates followed. The who had seemed so bored during earlier sessions suddenly discovered urgent reasons to oppose expansion. The small species who had been ready to sacrifice human colonies in exchange for peace now realized that appeasement might invite the very destruction they were trying to avoid. Speaker finally restored order and called for a formal vote. The question was simple. Would the Assembly demand withdrawal from all occupied territories, with full restoration of the affected population? Vote was not even close. 11 species voted in favor. Only the vote against, and their single voice meant nothing against the united opposition. Our host stood in stunned silence as the result was announced. His government had sent him here expecting an easy victory. Instead, he would return home to explain how a species with a tenth of their military strength had turned the entire galaxy against them with a single sentence. Approached the human delegation one final time. His scales had settled into a dull gray that indicated resignation. He asked Lisa Monroe if humanity would really have done it. Would they really have burned worlds over 12,000 colonists? So looked at Daniel, who finally spoke again. He said that he sincerely hoped no one would ever have to find out, but he suggested the ambassador consider this. Humans had used atomic weapons on their own kind. They had burned their own cities and poisoned their own land rather than submit to conquest. If they were willing to do that to themselves, what might they be willing to do to someone else? Said no answer. He turned and walked away, already composing the message that would order forces to withdraw. That evening, Daniel and Lisa stood in the observation room overlooking the station garden. They watched as ship began departing from the docking bays, their drives glowing blue against the darkness of space. So asked Daniel if he had been bluffing. He had spoken with such conviction, such calm certainty. Had he really believed humanity would choose mutual destruction over surrender? It was quiet for a long time. Then he said that the best threats were the ones you never had to follow through on. The galaxy now believed humans were capable of anything when pushed far enough. That belief would protect humanity far more effectively than any fleet or fortress. He pressed him, but was it true? Would humanity really have plans to avoid conquest? He'll turned to look at her. His eyes held something old and tired and infinitely sad. He said that he hoped they would never find out. He hoped humanity would never be pushed that far. He hoped the choice would never have to be made. If it came to that, he said, humans had always been very good at doing terrible things for the people they loved. Crystals in the observation room wall flickered briefly, then settled into a soft blue. The color of peace, or perhaps just the color of a threat successfully delivered. The stars burned cold and bright, witnesses to a galaxy that had just learned to fear the quiet one.